In the archives of the world's great cities, a puzzling trend emerges. Countless 19th-century photographs show majestic urban streets and plazas completely devoid of people. Imagine a scene of Victorian London or Gilded Age New York, grand boulevards lined with ornate buildings, yet not a single pedestrian or horse-drawn carriage in sight. It's as if someone pressed pause on city life, turning bustling metropolises into eerie ghost towns. Historians and photographers have long noted this phenomenon. For example, one of the earliest photos ever taken, Louis Daguerre's 1838 image of Paris's Boulevard du Temple, appears utterly empty at first glance. In that famous daguerreotype, a lone man having his boots shined is the only human figure captured on an otherwise vacant Parisian street. The rest of the boulevard's usual crowds and traffic simply vanish into thin air on the image. This pattern isn't limited to Paris. Early photographs of New York, London, Berlin, and other major cities display a similar haunting stillness. Cobblestone avenues stretch out with no sign of the teeming populations that we know lived there. A visitor from another time peering at these images might wonder, was the world depopulated in the mid-1800s? Did these great cities stand mysteriously empty? The effect is undeniably spooky, and it has led many to question what was really happening when these photographs were taken. Are these images merely a quirk of old technology, or do they hint at a deeper historical mystery? Photographic experts offer a straightforward explanation for the empty city photos: long exposure times. In the early days of photography, cameras required the shutter to be open for minutes, sometimes 20 to 30 minutes, to expose an image properly. Anything moving through the scene during that time would blur into invisibility, leaving only stationary objects recorded on the plate. Buildings, streets, and trees stayed put, but people, horses, and carts in motion simply didn't register. In Degas' 1838 Paris photo, the only reason the bootblack, shoeshiner, and his customer appear is that they remained almost perfectly still for several minutes. Everyone and everything else on that busy boulevard was moving and thus vanished from the frame. Early city photos seemed empty not necessarily because the streets were truly deserted, but because life was too dynamic to be captured by the slow cameras of the era. By the late 1850s, however, camera technology had improved. Exposure times shortened dramatically, making it possible to freeze much of the busy throng of city life on film. A British photographer in 1856 excitedly noted that views of famous cities would no longer look plague-stricken and empty, but would appear alive with the busy throng of their motley populations, thanks to faster exposure techniques. Indeed, photographs from the 1860s onward began to show more and more people. One image of Broadway in New York City in the 1860s, for instance, captures a bustling crowd on the sidewalks and carriages jammed in the street. So, if technology could finally capture the crowds, why do so many late 19th century photos still look like ghost towns? Critics point out a few factors. In some cases, photographers deliberately shot at dawn or chose quiet Sundays to document architecture without distraction. Pioneers like Charles Marville and Eugène Auger, for example, rose early specifically to photograph Paris's buildings and streets empty of people, because their mission was preserving images of the urban landscape itself, not its inhabitants. Even when faster film existed, these artists preferred the aesthetic of silence, an uninterrupted view of monuments unmarred by crowds. A striking example is Marville's image of the normally bustling Rue de Rivoli in Paris, which looks utterly abandoned. In short, sometimes the emptiness was an artistic choice or a practical step to avoid blurry moving figures. But here's where the intrigue deepens. Not all empty city photos can be explained away by long exposures or artistic intent. There are photographs from the late 1800s by which time street scenes could be captured with life and motion that still show remarkably vacant public squares and thoroughfares. Furthermore, even in earlier decades, a few photographs somehow managed to capture crowds or busy scenes, proving it was possible. This contrast between bustling images and completely empty ones has been described as a strange contradiction. It raises the question, if the cities were truly full of people, wouldn't more photos show that? Is it just coincidence that so many images across different cities and years depict the same eerie emptiness? Skeptical voices start to ask, could there have been moments in history when these cities actually were empty? Perhaps an event or circumstance left normally crowded capitals temporarily devoid of inhabitants. The traditional explanation, slow cameras, deliberate timing, might not tell the whole story. What if something occurred in the mid-19th century that literally emptied out urban centers for a time? It sounds like science fiction or a conspiracy fever dream, yet this is exactly the line of inquiry that some researchers and history enthusiasts are pursuing. Out on the fringes of historical research, in internet forums, YouTube documentaries, and obscure blogs, a provocative theory has emerged to explain these photographic anomalies. It's often called the Great Reset or mud flood theory, and at its core is the suggestion that our history books might be missing a massive event in the 1800s. According to this theory, there was a global civilizational reset, a catastrophe, such as a cataclysmic flood of mud, plague, or other disaster, that wiped out much of the world's population and effectively ended a previous high civilization. In this scenario, the great empty cities captured in those photos weren't empty just because of camera settings. They were literally devoid of people because something had depopulated them. The beautiful architecture and advanced infrastructure remained, but the inhabitants were gone, at least for a time. One version of the theory focuses on a supposedly lost global empire known as Tartaria or Tartary. Believers contend that Tartaria was a highly advanced civilization that existed into the 18th or 19th century, boasting impressive architecture and technology, but that it was deliberately erased from history. In their view, many of the grand buildings we attribute to 19th century European and American architects, from elegant old-world capitals to elaborate exhibition halls, were actually built by this earlier empire. The theory holds that a series of mud floods or other catastrophes buried cities around the world, collapsing the Tartarian Empire and killing off its populace sometime in the 1800s. The empty cities were later dug out, cleaned up, and repopulated by the victors of a new order, who then took credit for the architectural marvels and rewrote the history books to omit Tartaria's existence. It sounds far-fetched, like a historical fantasy, but proponents point to some thought-provoking evidence. They note, for instance, that old maps from the 16th, 18th centuries label a vast region of Asia as Tartaria, implying a large, possibly unified territory. Mainstream historians explain this as a catch-all term European cartographers used for Siberia and Central Asia, not evidence of a single empire. Conspiracists, however, ask why this empire vanished from later maps so completely. They also highlight architectural oddities, buildings across the world in the 1800s sporting similar grandiose styles like domes, towers, and monumental columns, as if a unified aesthetic or technology was at work globally. Could these be the remnants of Tartaria's architecture, inherited rather than invented by 19th century societies? Some even claim that iconic structures, the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., or Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral, for example, far predate their officially recorded construction and were actually built by the prior civilization. Under this theory, the 19th century governments simply found these buildings intact and repurposed them, while telling the world they themselves built them. One dramatic piece of this narrative involves the World's Fairs and international expositions of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The fairs, such as the 1876 Philadelphia Exposition, the 1903 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and the 1915 Panama Pacific Expo in San Francisco, featured sprawling complexes of ornate, temporary buildings. Officially, these buildings were built just for the fairs and then demolished or lost to fire. But Tartaria enthusiasts are not convinced. They argue that the fairground palaces and grand pavilions, with their startlingly sophisticated designs, were actually the leftover cities of the old empire, briefly revealed to the public before being intentionally destroyed. For example, they claim San Francisco's Expo palaces were not built from scratch in 1915, but were ancient structures from Tartaria's capital, marvels of a forgotten age, later passed off as mere exposition decor. The striking emptiness seen in some photos of these fairgrounds, often taken in early morning or after hours, adds fuel to their suspicions. They show regal plazas and exhibition halls with hardly a soul around, as if we're glimpsing an abandoned city of the gods. Central to the reset theory is the idea of infrastructure preceding population. If a reset occurred, the theory suggests, the mid-19th century would have featured a period when cities full of infrastructure, stately buildings, extensive road networks, railways and canals, even advanced technology like electric streetcars or lighting, stood mostly empty until a new population arrived or grew to occupy them. Intriguingly, they point to real historical puzzles that kind of fit this pattern. For instance, by the 1840s and 1850s, many American cities had sprawling railway systems and canal networks, even though the nation's population was relatively small and spread out. Who were these ambitious projects built for? Similarly, enormous public buildings, state capitals, cathedrals, courthouses, were erected in young towns with very modest population and limited manpower, prompting the question of how such small communities managed such grand construction, or whether they inherited those structures. While conventional history has answers, often involving immigrant labor, borrowed European architectural designs, and sheer human determination, the reset theorists prefer an alternate interpretation. The cities were built by a previous civilization, and 19th century societies simply moved into the empty shells. In their view, the orphaned infrastructure was waiting for new inhabitants, like a stage set waiting for actors. Could it be true? Most academics strongly reject these notions, citing extensive records and evidence for gradual development through the 18th and 19th centuries. There is no geological proof of a recent worldwide mud flood, nor credible documentation of a wiped-out global empire. Yet the intrigue persists, fueled by those haunting old photos and the occasional bizarre detail of history. Even a tiny grain of truth can keep the speculation alive. After all, we know that history can hide untold stories. Entire cities have vanished from memory before, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists centuries later. Is it entirely impossible that something significant happened in the 1800s that we're only dimly grasping now? The empty city photographs prod us to wonder, inviting us into a historical twilight zone where official explanations and fringe theories collide. One reason the empty cities theory has gained traction is that we are witnessing similar phenomena today, albeit for very different reasons. In modern times, ghost cities have emerged in various parts of the world, places built to be vibrant urban centers that, for years, remain sparsely populated. These real-life examples show that massive infrastructure can exist ahead of population, feeding the imagination that perhaps a comparable scenario once befell the 19th century. China offers the most famous examples. During the last 2 decades, China experienced a construction boom that at times outpaced the country's actual needs. Entire new cities were planned and built from scratch, with high-rise apartment clusters, glittering office towers, sports stadiums, museums, and boulevards before enough people moved in to fill them. The result, strange, modern-day ghost cities waiting for residents. The poster child of this phenomenon was Ordo's new town, Kangbashi in Inner Mongolia. Intended to house up to 1 million people, Kangbashi was a showcase of futuristic urban planning. But after its completion, only a fraction of that population came. By 2016, roughly 100,000 people lived there, leaving the city about 2/3 empty and eerily quiet. A 2017 study noted that Kangbashi's capacity was 300,000, but only about 10% of its residences were occupied in its early years. Photographs from that era show wide streets devoid of traffic and plazas devoid of pedestrians, a surreal sight in a nation known for its bustling crowds. China's ghost city phenomenon wasn't just Ordos. Dozens of newly built districts across the country initially stood largely empty as well. Rapid construction led to new urban zones where the expected rush of inhabitants never appeared, leaving vacant skyscrapers and unused highways.
A Chinese study using Baidu, the domestic web giant, even identified 50 huge regions with strikingly low occupancy despite heavy development. Over time, many of these places, including Ordo's Kangbashi, have gradually filled in. The empty apartments eventually find tenants as population growth catches up, or government policies relocate people there. But for a period, reality looked like science fiction, cities without people, infrastructure awaiting life. Half a world away, in Myanmar, Burma, we find another uncanny parallel. In 2005, Myanmar's military government unveiled a brand new capital city, Naypyidaw, built in secret in the country's interior. Naypyidaw is an enormous planned city, about 6 times the size of New York City in area, featuring extravagant public works. It boasts multi-lane highways, some stretches are a staggering 20 lanes wide, grand government complexes, modern housing, golf courses, and even a safari park. The only thing it lacked? People. For many years after its opening, observers reported that Naypyidaw felt virtually empty. Its vast boulevards were so devoid of traffic that one could stand in the middle of a 20-lane road in broad daylight without seeing a car in either direction. On paper, the city's population was said to be around 1 million, but on the ground, the streets were silent, the shopping malls largely vacant, giving the impression of a post-apocalyptic landscape or a bizarre capital built for nobody. Photographs and first-hand accounts from the 2010s describe driving through a modern metropolis that felt like a ghost town, an almost unsettling experience of infrastructure without inhabitants. Even Africa has seen a version of this. In Angola, a Chinese-built satellite city called Quilamba near the capital Luanda made headlines as a ghost town in 2012. Designed to house 500,000 people in gleaming apartment blocks, Quilamba was constructed at a cost of $3.5 billion and completed in just a few years. Yet, when a BBC reporter visited about a year after apartments went on sale, the city was spookily quiet. Only 220 apartments had been sold out of the first batch of 2,800, and the vast majority of buildings stood empty. The freshly paved roads saw almost no cars, storefronts were shuttered with no shops operating, voices echoed off concrete walls because hardly anyone was around. It was a ready-made city waiting for residents who had not arrived. Over time, Quilamba's occupancy did improve, prices were lowered and middle-class buyers moved in, but for a while, it too was a brand new ghost city. These modern cases demonstrate that empty cities are not just a myth. They can and do exist under certain economic and political conditions. Of course, the causes in these examples are well understood: overambitious development, misaligned planning, or strategic relocation of capitals. No one suggests a mysterious catastrophe emptied Ordos or Naypyidaw. We know people simply hadn't moved in yet. If we, in the 21st century, can look at Ordos or Naypyidaw and be reminded of a city after the apocalypse, one might ask, could something akin to an empty city scenario have occurred in the past for other reasons? The ghost cities of today at least make the idea conceptually plausible. They show how infrastructure and population can...
At the end of this journey through mysteries, we're left with tantalizing questions and a spectrum of answers. On one end, we have the prosaic explanations. Early photography needed long exposures, and many 19th century city photos were intentionally taken at quiet moments or with technology limitations, hence the emptiness. There's no great conspiracy in that view, just the convergence of art and science in a way that produced ghostly images. On the other end, we have the grand conspiracy narrative, a lost civilization, a cataclysmic reset, ghost cities repopulated by survivors, and a concerted effort to erase and rewrite the history of the world around the mid-1800s. According to this view, those empty street photos are smoking gun evidence, visual proof that something was terribly amiss in cities across the globe. The truth, as always, might lie somewhere in between or entirely elsewhere. What makes the lost history theories compelling to some is that history has been intentionally rewritten before, maybe not on the global scale that Tartaria enthusiasts imagine, but in significant ways. History is written by the victors, as the old saying goes, and there are documented cases of regimes erasing or altering the record of the past.
Consider the example of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who over 2,000 years ago reportedly burned books and buried scholars to wipe out prior teachings and standardize thought in his new empire. And so, inconvenient records were destroyed and dissenting intellectuals silenced. In more recent times, we've seen governments cover up events, archives sealed or lost, and cultural knowledge wiped out through colonization or conflict. The notion that parts of our history might be hidden or misrepresented is not absurd in itself. The open question is whether something as enormous as an advanced worldwide civilization and a 19th century cataclysm could really be suppressed in our collective memory. Mainstream scholars argue that if such an event occurred, there would be obvious evidence, layers in the geological record, contemporaneous writings describing it, mass graves or ruins unaccounted for in the timeline. They point instead to the rich context we do have about the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, population explosions in cities. London and New York grew exponentially in the 19th century. They weren't empty at all. And the very human stories of immigrants, engineers, and laborers who actually built those railroads, canals, and Capitol domes. From this perspective, the empty streets are a technical illusion, and the grandeur of 19th century infrastructure is a testament to our forebears' ingenuity, not evidence of a forgotten precursor race. And yet, the mystery lingers in the public imagination. Those old photos feel inexplicably off. The idea of a reset scratches an itch in a time when many people sense there is more to our past than we're taught. It doesn't help that the 19th century was indeed full of turmoil, wars, unexplained fires that ravaged many cities, and rapid changes, which conspiracy thinkers stitch together into a grand alternative narrative. The intrigue is amplified by the dramatic notion that we might be a civilization with amnesia, collectively forgetting an entire chapter of our story. It's healthy to question and to marvel at the unexplained, as long as we also scrutinize the evidence. On this topic, there may never be a definitive answer that satisfies everyone. Perhaps the empty 19th century cities were simply a quirk of camera technology and photographers' choices, a perfect storm of circumstances that created an illusion of abandonment. Or perhaps those images are clues to something we've yet to fully uncover, a whisper from the past hinting at a truth stranger than fiction. One thing is certain, the next time you see an old black and white photograph of a grand city boulevard with not a soul in sight, you'll feel a slight chill. You'll wonder, even just for a moment, what exactly was happening that day the photo was taken. Our history as written is a vast tapestry, but there are threads that hang loose and colors that don't quite match. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, the mystery of the empty cities invites you to tug at those loose threads, to explore the shadows between the facts, and to never stop seeking the truth, whatever it may be. In the end, we're left with a haunting possibility. If some parts of the past were intentionally obscured or reset, would we even know it? History may not be a full conspiracy, but it certainly has its mysteries, and the empty cities of the 19th century remain one of the most evocative and enigmatic. Do you believe it was just slow shutter speeds or something more? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.